I am proud to be Western. And every day I grow more aware of how fortunate I am to have been born and raised in this part of the world. In this video, I want to share my thoughts on why it is essential today to cultivate a deeper awareness of what it means to be Western. If you visit any university campus or if you speak with young people of college age, you will discover that their minds have been filled with profoundly negative ideas about the West. The West is portrayed solely as a colonial power, as the architect of slavery, as the oppressor of women and homosexuals. In short, the West seems to be the father of all evils. The West is depicted as the homeland of patriarchy. And so a young Western person growing up in today's educational system essentially grows up with an enormous prejudice against their own civilization. I believe we need to go deeper. First of all, we must understand what we actually mean when we say the West. Let us start with etymology. Occident in Latin simply means where the sun sets. Orient means where the sun rises. This terminology comes from a very specific historical period, when the Roman Empire divided itself into two parts, one gravitating around the Western territories and one around Constantinople in the east. The empire became two, gradually evolving into two profoundly different realities. And from that moment on began the division between East and West, all within the Roman world. So the context in which the concept of the West was born is undoubtedly Roman. Now, like every concept, like every word, the West needs its opposite to define itself. There is no white without black. If everything were white, we would have no need to define white and black. The West exists because there is also the East. These two experiences, initially similar because they were both shaped by the Roman system, eventually separated. Officially, in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell. The Eastern Roman Empire survived until 1453. What happened then? The paths of these two Roman realities diverged, and the West began to acquire a series of distinctive characteristics. First, there is the geographic element. When we speak of the West, there is a geographic reality. It is the western part where the sun sets. But over the centuries, this geographic identity began to absorb deeper meanings. The identity of the West acquired very precise characteristics through its passage through history. The first characteristic, which in truth it initially shared with what we now call the Byzantine Empire, is connected to the biblical foundation, the deep Judeo-Christian root. This Judeo-Christian root teaches us something fundamental. In Genesis, God creates man in his own image and likeness. Therefore, all those who gravitate around the Judeo-Christian world have planted deep in their minds, often even below the threshold of awareness, the idea that every human being is made in the image and likeness of God. And if a human being is made in God's image and likeness, they will have very specific attributes. The first attribute, which I believe is foundational to Western identity, and which has emerged more and more clearly over the centuries, is individual liberty. Individual liberty, which in other cultures is not only unknown but actively opposed, is the distinctive character of the West. If I am made in God's image and likeness, I will be free to make my own choices, even choices that might harm me, that might harm others. You can see that a collectivist mentality, as tends to predominate in Eastern realities, meaning what we today define as the Orient, so not what remained of the Byzantine Empire, but Asia, the Far East, or the Middle East. In these places, we do not find the same awareness of individual liberty. Instead, there is a deep sense of community, of belonging to something larger from a social point of view. This is a truly distinctive trait. And I believe that upon this concept of liberty, in the centuries following the fall of the Roman Empire and the arrival of the Middle Ages, our civilization was built. What does this liberty bring? Obviously, if we have a civilization with many free men, or men with more freedom than others, if you give people the possibility to be free, free people will try to be the architects of their own destiny. They will gradually create a free society. And a free society creates a free market. And where there is a free market, there is prosperity. Today we look at the West, and the whole world looks at the West as a place of prosperity, a place where even now there is considerable wealth. And this wealth enables a certain style of life. All of this springs from this fundamental idea of individual liberty. Obviously, someone might object, but China is becoming wealthy. Certainly, but China is doing it on completely different presuppositions. China is a Marxist regime with applied socialism, more or less a dictatorial system that combines state activity with entrepreneurial activity. It is a very different system. Our system, that of individual liberty, is also what allows us to say. And this differentiates us enormously from any other people we know. That if I have a divine element within me, if I am made in God's image and likeness, and you too are made in God's image and likeness, like all human beings, then despite the diversity that may distinguish us, we all have something equal. And upon this idea, the entire Western legal system was built, which over the centuries began to generate individual rights and duties. Every person has rights that not even the state can question. There is a legal system that seeks justice and cannot be challenged even by the most powerful. The concept of the rule of law serves precisely this purpose, to guarantee individuals the possibility of not having to suffer violence simply because someone is stronger than you and does not recognize your equality, your divine image. This is the Western construct. From this derive many things. Individual rights derive from this, even in more modern terms. The West has arrived as the only experience, the only civilization, at the idea that whatever characteristic we put in question, no human characteristic can prejudice that sense of equality and rights. And therefore, in the West were born all those battles connected to women's rights. Feminism, that in its original form demanded greater spaces and greater rights for women who could not vote or who had limited rights in certain historical contexts. The same applies to the homosexual community. Only in the West was born the battle for homosexuals to have, as such, without having to hide their identity, a space in society and rights of individual liberty. So the West is extraordinarily clear in its identity. It is an identity of liberty. This is the word we should always keep at the center when we speak of the West. But I want to say that today it is particularly important to regain awareness of the conquest the West has made and shared with the world. Not only scientific conquests, not only prosperity, but conquest of civilization, conquest connected to equality of rights, conquest connected to personal liberty. This is why today it is urgent that we Westerners wake up and regain awareness of who we are. Because there are very powerful forces, both inside and outside the West, that want at all costs to erase our identity and relegate the West to a dimension of memory. They want the West to no longer exist. They want to destroy and conquer the West. And who are these forces? The first force is one that has always opposed the West. In fact, the West itself has often identified itself, in contrast to this reality, becoming itself through confrontation with it. And this is Islamic civilization. Islamic civilization is founded on profoundly different presuppositions compared to Western Judeo-Christian civilization. Islamic civilization does not have as its idea that the human being is made in the image and likeness of God. The human being must only submit to God and must submit to a text. And this is the essence of Islamic civilization. It is a religion, and people very often live it as a religious matter. But the moment it transforms, as it tends to do, into political ideology, that political ideology becomes in fact a totalitarian thought for us Westerners, because it does not admit individual liberty. You know that even the most advanced Islamic countries, I refer for example to the UAE or Morocco, cannot introduce into their legal systems. The possibility that a Muslim can change religion. There is no religious freedom in Islamic civilization, while in the West, anyone can choose whatever religion they want. In the Islamic world, no, because rights are acquired. The closer one is to the ideal written in the Quran: full rights for Muslims, somewhat fewer rights for Jews and Christians. The infidels should have no rights. This is more or less the foundation. So it is not a universalistic idea, but an idea tied to the particularism of being Muslim. Do you see the difference? There is no space for universalism in this civilization. Western civilization instead is universalist. But throughout its history, the Islamic world has sought to conquer the West, and in part it has succeeded. The territories of North Africa were essentially Western territories. They would have become European states if Islam had not arrived, because they were part of the Roman Empire, because they were deeply mixed with Roman culture. There were Christian kingdoms there, but then Islam arrived, colonized all that territory, and there was a rupture. That land was no longer West. Islam had also conquered Spain and Sicily, which were later reconquered. This expansionist desire that Islam has targeted the West. And how does it seek to enter? Not in a military way, because it would not have the means to do so, but through our very instruments of liberty. If one is free to adhere to any religion, because individual liberty provides that anyone can choose any religion, then send many people there who will become Muslims and who will gradually take the place of Westerners and establish a new civilization that will be Muslim, and where there will no longer be individual liberty as we have conceived it in the West. This is the strategy. But this strategy could never work if there were not another great enemy of the West, perhaps the true one, the greatest one, which is its true negation, and which is the enemy against which the West fought throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, what was incarnated in the Soviet Union. That collectivist and dialectical materialist ideology, that was communism. When this ideology manifested itself as communism and became a form of government, a form of managing real power, it had that name, communism, but it had certain presuppositions. The first was dialectical materialism. There is nothing outside of matter. So how can a human being be made in God's image and likeness if God does not exist, if there is no divine dimension? You see that the foundation of the West is erased. And all of this took deep root in the East. Look carefully. Russia, which is the East, is Asia for the vast majority of its territory. Russia, China, Southeast Asian countries. This idea that postulates collectivism has taken root very well there. In the West, it had much more difficulty. In the West, the antibodies of individual liberty made communism an enemy, except among intellectuals and certain other situations. There were many Western communists. And indeed, that is the problem. The problem is that, unfortunately, often the European left has identified itself with the enemy of the West. It has not identified itself as a progressive force that wants to move Western progress forward, but as a force that wants to destroy the identity, the base, the foundation of the West itself. Today, this same force articulates itself in a much more subtle ideology, in that woke ideology that has as its presupposition the idea that there is a perpetrator and a victim in everything. Women are victims. Homosexuals are victims. All those who are not white are victims. And there is only one perpetrator, only one guilty party, the white Western male. Now, if the enemy is the white Western male, in fact, the enemy is the West. So you understand well that these ideologies are in fact profoundly anti-Western ideologies. And indeed, the only narrative they convey is that of a West that is essentially a colonizer, exploiter, slaver, oppressor of women, oppressor of homosexuals, oppressor of everyone. But this narrative fails to recognize that the West is not only this. Now, far be it from me to say that Western humans are not also capable of evil. The problem is that we are able to see our own wickedness, and therefore we are able to make incredible self-criticism about what happened with colonialism, about what happened in the past. Our past seems like hell when we try to use our self-criticism. But then we omit to say that all other peoples of the earth are equal to us. We omit to say that good and evil are mixed in the human being in equal measure. In men, women, Eastern, Western, the human being is this. And we attribute the weight of evil to Western identity when we should attribute it to human identity. The human being is that marvelous creature in which God has placed a spark of the divine, but which was needed from mud and nothingness. We always forget this part of the story. So if the human being is neither good nor bad, but contains everything within, you understand that the enemy is not Western identity. The enemy is not Western values. On the contrary, Western values are those that allow us that individual liberty, which enables us to make self-criticism, something that in China is impossible, in the Islamic world is absolutely impossible. And we, by continuing in this process, this part of the Western world that adheres to post-Marxist culture, does nothing but try to self-destruct. So you understand that faced with this situation, someone who wants to conquer you from the outside, someone from the inside who wants to destroy you, it is necessary that our antibodies of liberty react and make us rediscover that deep awareness that makes us say that we live in the most beautiful place in the world, that we have the fortune to have individual liberty that allows us to be whoever we want, that allows us to say whatever we want, that allows us to be in search of who we truly are without anyone else being able to stop us. This is the ideal of individual liberty. So I think that today, more and more people should return to saying, indeed to shouting, "Long live the West." And more people should regain awareness of what it truly means to be Western. If you like this channel, subscribe. Help me spread these videos. Turn on notifications. And remember, long live the West.